My name is Catherine Arndt and I'm the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. I hope you enjoy today's Connect episode, brought to you by the VLGA, the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Steve Cooper from the VLGA and this is the first interview in our 2022 election series with the sort of regional peaks, I suppose. Today I'm really pleased to welcome Councillor Mary-Ann Brown, who's the chair of Rural Councils Victoria and also happens to be a councillor at the Southern Grampians Shire. Councillor Brown, Mary-Ann, welcome.
Steve, it's great to be with you and the audience today. Thank you for that welcome.
Not a problem at all. We think it's really important to be talking to councils around the state, not only in the lead up to the election, but in terms of when the new government comes in, about their advocacy priorities. So if we're going to be talking about Rural Councils Victoria, maybe we should start by just the simple question of, who are you?
So we've got 34 rural councils that are members of our organisation. And so in the Victorian local government, you've got the metropolitan councils, there's the peri-urban group and the regional cities, including Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, Warrnambool, Horsham and so forth. And we're the third group. So we cover 75% of the state's geographic area, which is significant. And we also are responsible for over 60% of the road network in the state. So there's some interesting challenges around that geographic area, but that's who we are. So, and we advocate very strongly for our communities as well as our member councils.
Well, I'm presuming you have to, there's a whole lot of pickings that, or sort of rich pickings that we'll come back to, Mary-Ann, in terms of that road network and presumably what happens, because you need to advocate. You haven't got the kind of density of population of some of your other council colleagues. So presumably there's some other things going on in the rural councils that are not just about people and houses. Correct.
And Steve, probably to put it in context, we often discuss the fact that there's some really critical services in terms of our economy that are generated in rural Victoria. So power's generated there, water is stored and food is produced. And in fact, Victoria is the largest agricultural producer in Australia. So rural communities have a very significant role to play in terms of both the state and the national economy. And for that reason, it's really important that there is investment in those communities so that they're sustainable and can support those economic activities. And that really underpins our advocacy to state and federal government.
Yeah, so all of those places that we know and love, that's terrific, but maybe for the metro folk like me, we should be also looking a little bit deeper at what's going on in those communities in terms of the range of production.
And I think that's true, Steve. Tourism is a really critical part of our economies because one of the things we have seen, agriculture has become much more efficient in terms of reducing the labour input, and part of that is because farmers haven't been able to get staff, so that's occurred. But tourism and hospitality play a very big role in our economies, particularly as an employer, but also in bringing money into our communities. And we saw that very strongly during the pandemic. When Victorians couldn't travel interstate and when they were able to travel more freely, there were significant influxes of visitors to many of our communities. And again, that's another reason why it's really important to make sure that our communities are sustainable and can provide a good level of service, not only to residents, but to visitors as well.
I'll move on to roads, Mary-Ann, but just to sort of round out that point, I presume one of the elements that you're talking about is if you've got these other industries, you've got a sort of critical economic mass, if you like, to ensure that, or to support towns and cities in being able to continue to provide services for our farming communities.
So, Steve, local government has got is responsible for a very significant road network. My council, for instance, has got over 3,000 kilometres of roads, and that would be similar for many of our members. And the challenges for us are, but both that road network, which then hooks into the state government network, is really probably the primary way that produce gets to market, but also how people might be accessing health services, other services, running their businesses, just going about their daily lives, because many of our areas are quite poorly serviced by public transport, be it freight or passenger services. So it's really important that the road network is good. And what we have seen prior to the flooding events, the road network was in a poor state. We had already made a call on the state government to increase funding both to local government and to rural roads, regional roads Victoria, and that road network has suffered significantly as a result of the flooding and continues to do so. So there needs to be a really significant investment, both by the state government and the federal government, to bring that road network up to standard so it is safe.
So can we be really clear on that point, Mary-Ann, that rural councils had a long-standing advocacy position prior to the recent flooding that road funding across the state was inadequate?
Yes, we have, and we've been pressing that for quite a while. And as I said, that's one of the key asks in our state election platform.
So that's important, Mary-Ann. What about the impact of the recent flooding, which presumably we don't know yet?
Well, I don't think the dollar amount of damage is clear. We've had one council that has assessed the damage at this stage at $70 million to their road network. And given that there's probably, I think, about 30 rural local government areas have been impacted by flooding in some way, we expect that figure to be much higher. At this stage, the state government has allocated $165 million for the road network. That is not going to be anywhere near sufficient. We've seen in New South Wales, they've actually, local government New South Wales has declared a roads emergency, and they're estimating the type of investment over a period of time is probably in the order of $5 billion. Whether we're looking at that sort of amount in Victoria, but I certainly think we would be looking at over $1 billion for a start.
What's the economic payback, Mary-Ann?
Well, I think, Steve, as I've indicated, the road network is really critical in terms of getting produce to market, but also for communities to function effectively. So I think that's really what underpins it. And that investment in good roads pays off. And I think the other stat, which is concerning, is that people are 4 times more likely to die on country roads than they are in the metropolitan area. So there's also that human cost. And look, road conditions are not the sole cause of fatalities, but they are a significant contributor.
Oh, absolutely. No, it is so important. We'll move on, Mary-Ann. With these communities in rural Victoria, they need somewhere to live. What's the advocacy position around housing?
So a couple of years ago, we commissioned a report, our housing blueprint, which identified that over 15 years, rural Victoria needs 87,000 new houses. And one of the challenges that is facing us is attracting people. Generally, many of our communities have a very low level of unemployment. And if we want to attract people to fill those vacancies, we need to be able to offer them somewhere to live. We saw it at one level last summer where particularly many of the towns that have very high tourism visitation were struggling to get staff in cafes, hotels, restaurants. And some of those staff were living in really poor conditions. Some of them were camping in tents, caravans, or travelling significant distances. So that's just one of the challenges. But then it's also about attracting staff like health professionals, solicitors, accountants. So they need somewhere to live, and just about all of our communities have housing shortages. So there needs to be a significant investment both in social housing and also trying to attract the private sector. And that is a particular challenge in rural communities because you don't necessarily have the scale to get the large developers in. So there needs to be probably some financial incentives there, or one of the things we've talked about is a fund that councils can access if they're developing land that subsidises the cost of the necessary infrastructure before land goes on the market. So those are some of the things that would certainly help to alleviate that. There's probably no real quick fixes, unfortunately, because this is a problem that has been with us for a while and continues to be an issue.
But certainly came to the fore in sort of in that post-COVID time when rural communities have really struggled to find labour or somewhere for their labour force to live.
Indeed, yes, and yes.
Now, one of the drivers of that, of course, is tourism and the importance of tourism infrastructure. I understand RCV's got some views on that.
So we're asking for a dedicated rural tourism infrastructure fund. Again, and because I probably should have said this at the introduction, rural councils have a unique position in their communities. Often they're the largest employer, and also because of market failure, our communities often look to councils to provide services. And so, for example, my council, we've got an aerodrome, we've got an airport, we've got an art gallery, we provide a lot of the sporting facilities, performing arts centre, and some of those things in larger communities would be undertaken by different bodies. There'd be private investment. That doesn't occur often in our communities. So rural councils have a really critical role in terms of delivering some of those services. And tourism infrastructure is often one of them. And, for example, my council, in conjunction with some others, has got a volcanic trails master plan, which probably would cost about 70 million to deliver. We haven't got the financial capacity to do that alone. So we would be looking to state government, in this case, to provide some financial support to get that off the up and running.
Yep.
And our councils just don't have that financial capacity for large scale projects.
Yeah, and it's sounding as though, Mary-Ann, there would be that's the sort of project that needs external government funding to provide a huge economic hit
Yes.
to the area over a long time.
Yes, correct.
You touched before on the fact that rural councils often provide services that mightn't necessarily be provided by councils in the metropolitan area, for example. What might be some examples there where there are particular service provision issues for rural councils that you've got a position on?
Probably one of them is in the aged care sector. So a number of councils have been the provider of home-based care services, and the funding model for that has changed. Now, that's probably particularly a federal issue, but it is an example. In some of our rural council areas, there is no other provider. So if the funding model, and in many of these areas, whether it's maternal and child health or school crossings or kindergartens, often councils are the ones that are picking up the funding shortfalls, but rural councils are the least able to pick up to provide the funds to fill those gaps. And that is a trend that we're seeing, that gap between funding that's provided from the state for some of those services is actually decreasing, and obviously the costs are increasing. Our communities want those services, but often councils have got to make some very hard decisions about how they can continue to deliver those services because of the financial implications.
I would presume, Mary-Ann, that for many rural councils, compared with sort of larger regional and metro, if you took road funding out of the revenue statement, that a very high proportion of income, an extraordinary high proportion of income, comes from the rate base.
Yeah, so the two main sources of income for our council are rates and also grants. So both financial assistance grants, which is a federal funding stream, but also a variety of state grants for things like libraries, for example. So if there's a reduction in that grant funding, it really, well, some of our councils are already under significant financial pressure, and that was identified a few years ago in the Financial Sustainability Report that the state government commissioned. And it's actually deteriorated. You know, we're in an environment at the moment where rate capping is 1.75% this year, and inflation is likely to hit over 7%. So you're seeing an erosion in even the purchasing power of the income that you do have because of that significant gap. And I think the other challenge about that is if you're in an area where the population is static or is having small growth, even if the rates go up, you're asking those people to actually pay more, and there is a significant disparity which has been identified by the state government. You know, a property in Melbourne, you know, whatever it might be, 600,000 will be paying a lot less rates than that same property, say, in my shire, for instance.
Oh, absolutely an issue, and in terms of the ongoing sustainability of your member councils. Mary, just to finish it off, in terms of looking at the value proposition, if you like, of the RCV advocacy program, why is it important?
I think, Steve, there's a couple of things. I've touched on the economic importance of rural Victoria, and I think it's good to remind people about that. But I think it's also, there's an equity issue. You know, we're all Victorians, and I think there is an expectation that all residents have access to a basic level of services, whether it be good roads, health, education, just to mention a few. I think, and I've also touched on the tourism aspect. More Victorians are travelling within Victoria. And, you know, there are costs associated with having visitors. It's great to have visitors. We love it. But, you know, you've got to have a good road network. You need to be able to provide services when they come, whether it's waste services or offer good experiences, you know, walking tracks, cycling paths, all of those things. And funds are needed to provide those opportunities for people to have to experience the natural beauty of Victoria, which is fantastic.
And so your agricultural communities, your township communities, they're providing that kind of that social ecology, if you like, right throughout the state.
They are. And I think, you know, Steve, we saw during COVID how beneficial it was for people to be able to be outdoors, you know, walking, running, cycling, whatever. And the great outdoors is in rural Victoria, you know, and there's plenty of variety of activities, but, you know, you need to have communities that can support those visitors and make sure they have a great time, as well as providing a good level of services to their residents.
That's a great reminder to close out on, Mary-Ann, because of the fact that in finding a good thing out of COVID, that the fact that when we got out of lockdown, Melbourne just raced out to rural and regional Victoria is an important thing.
It is, and I think, you know, many Victorians probably have a greater appreciation of what they have in their own backyard, so to speak, because they had limited opportunities to go elsewhere, which has been a great thing for us. So, and there's a lot to offer.
Well, and thanks for adding to that appreciation today. Councillor Mary-Ann Brown of Southern Grampian Shire and the Chair of Rural Councils Victoria, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Steve, it's been a great pleasure. I'm always happy to spruik rural Victoria.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.